let's get to bet sizing on the flop. We're primarily going to be discussing continuation betting, but we will also be discussing raise sizes in general. So, if you recall the tournament masterclass, your bet size is primarily determined by who has the nut advantage, the range connectivity, how well your opponent's range will connect with the board, such that they have a lot of decently strong hands or they just have a lot of junk. Next, sack depth, and a new concept for this course, board dynamics. We're going to go through all of these first to make sure that you fully understand them. First, nut advantage. The player who has the nut advantage has more combinations of nut hands in their range than their opponent. And when you have the nut advantage, you bet larger. And when you do not have the nut advantage, you usually bet smaller. Again, there will be some corner cases where this does not necessarily apply, but these are general rules that will almost always hold true. As a very clear example of this, let's take a look at a spot where you raise the low jack and the big blind calls. The flop comes either 10-8-5 or Jack 5-5. In both these scenarios, you have the equity advantage by a pretty good amount. Notice we have 57% equity on 10-8-5, and we have 60% equity on Jack 5-5. Some people may think that that means you should be betting more often on the Jack 5-5, but no, that is not the case because we completely lack the nut advantage. Because if you look at our range, we have almost no effective nuts, which would be fives, right? We have almost no trip fives in our range. Compare that to the 10-8-5 board. Do we have 10-8 suited? Yes. Do we have 8-5 suited? No, but that's fine. Do we have pocket 10s? Yes. Pocket 8s? Yes. Pocket 5s? Yes. Aces, kings, queens, jacks, 10s, all those are, or aces, kings, queens, and jacks are all really good. Ace 10's really good. So on 10-8-5, we have essentially all the best hands, or the vast majority of all the best hands. Whereas on Jack 5-5, we do not. So that's going to lead to bigger bets on the 10-8-5 board. Notice we should usually be potting it or betting 60% on the 10-8-5 board. Whereas on the Jack 5-5 board, we should usually be betting tiny. Okay? Here is a chart that you can pull up in Pile Solver. We will have a few tools available for you to help make sure you're making good use of Pile Solver in this course as well, so make sure you check those out. This is a chart that you can pull up, though, that shows the equity of hands in your range based on the percentile that they are in. So, for example, the worst hands in positions range, who is the low jack in this scenario, has about, we'll call it 30-something% equity, okay? The worst hands in the out of position player's range, the big blind, is going to have something like 18% equity. So the worst hands in both players' range, if you compare those, the in position player's equity is way higher. And that is the case for all hands in this range on the 10-8-5. And anytime you see that the in position player, the line in red, if that line is decently far above the line in green, the out of position player's range, you're pretty much always going to be betting big and pretty frequently. And that's because you have both a range advantage and a nut advantage. Compare that to this chart here. Notice we see the same pattern where the red line is decently above the green line all the way until the end down here. Notice whenever you're looking at the best hands, the top 10% of hands either player can have, the line in red now dips below the line in green. And that's because the line in green, the out of position player, has a lot of fives. And those fives have something like 90, 95% equity, right? These hands are crushing the in position preflop raiser. So when you see this pattern happening, you will find that you have the range advantage, but you completely lack the nut advantage. So anytime these lines cross towards the end, or even when they intersect a lot, you're going to find that you usually don't use all that much big betting as the in-position preflop aggressor because you lack the nut advantage, okay? So when you have the range advantage and the nut advantage, you usually bet big and frequently. When you do not, you usually bet small, and depending on how much equity you have, you're either going to bet frequently or infrequently. If we had less equity, like say this red line was much closer to the green line, we would be betting even less often, okay? Next, let's discuss range connectivity. Range connectivity is how strongly the board hits your opponent's likely continuing range that they had before the flop. When your opponent's range connects well with the board, meaning they're going to have stuff like lots of straight draws, lots of flush draws, lots of pairs, etc., you're usually going to be betting larger. And when their range connects poorly with the board, meaning they have a whole lot of just absolute garbage, you usually want to bet smaller. And it is worth noting that range connectivity usually only applies when you have the range and nut advantage. If you do not have the range and nut advantage, then it doesn't really matter. Okay, you're going to find that nut advantage is really a strong driver of if you should be betting using a big or large size. But then once you do have the nut advantage, then some of these other traits come into play a little bit more often. So let's take a look here at King 7-2 versus King Queen 10, low jack versus big blind. Again, thinking about range connectivity of the opponent's range, on King 7-2, if they don't have a King, a 7, or a 2, they're pretty unhappy, right? And they're going to have a really difficult time continuing against any bet. So in this scenario, we see that we're using mostly very, very tiny bets. Whereas on King Queen 10, now we are using bigger bets in general. I mean, we have tiny bets as well, but we also are using a large chunk of 60% pot bets on the King Queen 10, because if you think about on King Queen 10, the opponent could easily have a pair, which is pretty good. They could have a jack, which is pretty good, or an ace or a 9, which is also pretty good. And whenever a lot of their range is pretty good, that leads to you betting using bigger sizes. Next, stack depth. Stack depth essentially determines your stack off threshold, which is the point at which a hand becomes happy enough to get all the money in right away. For simplicity, it makes the proportionally weaker hands count as the nuts. For example, if you have pocket 10s on 8, 7, 4, you're more than happy to get your money in 20 big blinds deep. But if you're playing 75 big blinds deep, that may not be the case, right? So essentially, when you're playing 20 big blinds deep, pocket 10s is the nuts, or the effective nuts on 8, 7, 4, but it is not the effective nuts whenever you're playing very deep stacked. So your stack off threshold determines which type of hands are included in the idea of nut advantage. And the deeper stacked you are, the more nutted a hand must be to determine if it actually is counted as part of your nut range. Here's a very clear example of this, where we are looking at an 8-5-4 board with a flush draw. In this scenario, 40 big blinds deep, you see that we're actually betting pretty frequently here, over half the time, 55%. And hands like pocket 10s and 9s are just betting big, 60% pot every time, just trying to get money into the pot. These hands are very happy to play a big pot. We're also betting a lot of our 9s and overpairs and whatnot, just very happy to get the money in. And the reason we get to bet using a kind of big size is because all of those hands count as part of the nut advantage. But if you look at when we're playing just a little bit deeper, 75 big blinds deep, you'll see now we are betting tiny, 25% pot with the vast majority of our range. And that's because now all these overpairs don't really count as the nuts, because if you look at our range, first off, we don't really have 7-6 suited whenever we're raising a little bit deeper stack, so we lack that hand. We don't have 5-4 suited, so we're lacking that hand. Compare that to this range over here where we have a little bit more of a nut advantage with both those hands in our range some. But more importantly, when you do happen to run into one of the many better hands that your opponent in the big blind could very easily have, you don't want to get stacked. So you're going to find that that leads to you having way less of a nut advantage. When you have less of a nut advantage, you bet smaller. Okay? If you're enjoying this video from the advanced tournament course, then why not sign up for Poker Coaching Premium and get the entire thing? It is long, it is in depth, and you will get full access to the entire course if you become a premium member right now. You can sign up at pokercoaching.com/Black Friday and get 61% off. Don't miss out. Next, board dynamics. So again, this primarily matters when you have the nut advantage. So board dynamics primarily matter when you have the nut advantage. Board dynamics are essentially the idea of how likely the board is to change on the turn and or river, such that the current nut hands are vulnerable to being outdrawn. Okay? And if you have a large nut advantage, the more vulnerable your nut hands are, these are again effective nut type hands are that you're happy to get in, the larger your bet size will typically be. And sometimes it's kind of difficult to figure out exactly if the board is very dynamic or not, because it depends on your opponent's range and also what is possible for your opponent to have. So let's take a look at a board like Ace Queen 2 with a flush draw. This is a very dynamic board because notice if you have an effective nut hand playing 40 big blinds deep like Ace King, that's a hand you're very happy getting your money in with, it's really vulnerable to being outdrawn. Notice for Ace King, a Jack or 10 is not particularly great. Also, any spade is not great. A 2 and a Queen are also not great. So there's a lot of pretty bad cards in this scenario for Ace King that your opponent could very easily have. So notice in this scenario, we have a very clear range advantage, very clear nut advantage, okay? Compare this to ace, king, 10 with no flush draw. Now, in this scenario, if you have queen, jack, that's the super nuts, pretty unlikely to get outdrawn. I know it could get outdrawn, but it's pretty unlikely to get outdrawn. Same thing for ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack. These hands are almost always good, but also they're very unlikely to get outdrawn. So again, you see we have a very big range and nut advantage. And some people may look at these two charts and think, all right, they're pretty similar, so we're going to do the same thing in both situations. But no, absolutely not, because the first board is very dynamic, ace, queen, 2 with a flush draw, compared to ace, king, 10. So if we look at the strategies in this scenario, you'll see that on ace, queen, 2 with a flush draw, usually what's going to happen on these very dynamic boards is you are going to bet very big with your hands that are almost always good but vulnerable to being outdrawn. And then you're going to bet smaller with your thinner value hands. So let's take a look at what's happening. Notice ace, king, ace, queen, ace, jack, and ace 10, and some ace 9s are all betting pot. They are betting big because they're almost always good at the moment, but highly likely to get outdrawn. You're also going to be wanting to bet big with your gut shots like jack 10, king, jack, and king 10. These are all hands that are betting very large. And then we have a smattering of flush draws and backdoor flush draws betting large as well. Notice we have some sporadic bluffs down here with the 5s, 4s, and 3s, which is always fun. But I really want you to look at the hands that are mainly betting very big in this spot. If you look at hands that are mostly betting small, we have a lot of low ace X, right? Have a lot of medium strength hands like king, queen, queen, jack, queen 10. Some underpairs, right? Some pocket kings, etc. So a lot of the medium strength hands in this scenario are going for a small bet. And then you're checking a lot of marginal made hands as well. And I realize, this strategy is going to be difficult to implement, but we're going to discuss that in just a minute. Anyway, though, I want to show you that we have a range advantage, we have a nut advantage, but we're actually not betting all that often here because the board is very dynamic. And when we do bet, we're usually betting very polarized with our big size and a little bit more linearly with our small size of 17% pot, which is one big blind. We're going to discuss that in a minute, too. All right. On ace, king, 10, the board that is way less dynamic, such that the current nut hands are way less likely to get substantially worse. On this board, we're just going to bet something like 60-ish% pot with everything because we have a big range advantage and a big nut advantage. Remember, compare this board here where the entire red line is way above the green line by a large margin. If you compare that to this board here, notice that the red line and the green line were much closer. And if you recall back, that was the that was this board here, the 10-8-5, where we're betting pretty big most of the time, but not quite as often, right? So we essentially have a much bigger range advantage. On the 10-8-5 board, we have 57% equity, whereas on the ace, king, 10 board, I think we had, 60-something% equity? Yeah, 67% equity. So we have a lot more equity. So we have more equity, which leads to betting more often in this scenario, 100%. And also we have a pretty big nut advantage, which leads us to betting very, very frequently. So you may have noticed sometimes in this section, in this course, we're discussing betting very big, like pot. And we're discussing betting very small, like one big blind. And we're going to be discussing moving from rigid to dynamic bet sizes. Dynamic bets are essentially bets that allow you to bet any option. We are playing no limit hold'em after all. Understand that adding these difficult strategies to your overall game plan will be difficult to implement without a lot of study and practice. But look, this is the advanced tournament course. You all are here trying to do your absolute best. You're taking it seriously, so you'll study and practice. You'll find that choosing to play a simple strategy, especially in spots that you are not familiar with, may not be the worst case, or the worst thing in the world, though, because it may result in you losing less EV than trying to implement a complex strategy very incorrectly. That said, you should learn to use dynamic bet sizes because you're going to gain more expected value by correctly playing your ranges more accurately, closer to GTO, right? You'll also take your opponents to areas of the game tree where they will not necessarily know how to play, which will result in them making mistakes and make you much more difficult to play against. If you consider spots where you bet one big blind on the flop, a lot of players don't know how to respond. They don't raise often enough. If you consider on the river, whenever you overbet the pot on the river, a lot of people won't know what to do. They won't know how wide to call it off with. And learning these strategies will go a long way to helping you really improve your skills. I mean, if you consider Daniel Negreanu, he had a heads-up match against Doug Polk a while back where he was using a GTO solver to study. And essentially, he started off, when he was very unfamiliar with heads-up poker, he realized it, he was using only a few bet sizes. Kind of like I recommended you all do in the Tournament Masterclass. On the flop, in the Tournament Masterclass, I recommended 1/3 pot or 2/3 pot bets. And on the turn and the river, I recommended a 1/3 pot, 2/3 pot, or an overbet. Fine. You're going to be doing way better off than most players if you use multiple bet sizes like this. But as Daniel Negreanu studied more and more, he started using dynamic bets and he started losing less. Who'd have thought? And as you start using more and more bet sizes, you use dynamic bet sizes, your edge is going to increase. Okay? Understand that as you get better and better, you must get skilled at using various bet sizes. And this course is going to go through all the common spots where you should very, very highly deviate from using 1/3 pot or 2/3 pot size bets. For example, let's take a look at a spot where we're 40 big blinds deep, button versus big blind. Okay? We raise button, big blind calls, flop comes queen 5-5. GTO strategy for all available bet sizes. If we let the solver use all bet sizes, we ran it with a bunch of numbers. The out of position player's EV is 2.837 big blinds. That's the big blind. Okay? But on queen 5-5, same board, if we only let the button use a 1/3 pot, which is what a lot of people do, out of position's EV is 2.88 big blinds. And that may not sound like all that much of a difference, but by using the correct bet size when you do decide to bet, which is 1 big blind in this scenario. Remember, on these low paired boards, you're going to see that very often the right bet size is 1 big blind. You actually gain 0.7 big blinds per 100 hands, assuming all things are equal against a good, strong, perfectly playing computer. And you got to realize that even though 0.7 big blinds per 100 may not sound like all that much, it's actually a lot, because a good win rate in high stakes games is something like 5 big blinds per 100 hands or 6 big blinds per 100 hands. So if you can win 0.7 big blinds more just by betting 1 big blind instead of 2 on these common spots, it gives you something like a 20% increase to your win rate, which is gigantic. And I want to make sure that you are aware of all of these gigantic spots, without really overwhelming you with overly complex strategies. We're going to discuss simplifying these complex strategies as well as we go forward. Now let's consider, what if you make the mistake of continuation betting 100% of the time on the queen 5-5 board right here? If you continuation bet every hand in your range for 1 big blind, out of position's equity is 2.932 big blinds, which, again, is worse than if you played perfectly, but not terrible, right? However, if you bet a 1/3 pot every time, their EV is 3.105 big blinds in this scenario. So by making the same error of continuation betting 100% of the time, but using the optimal 1 big blind size when you do make that error, you gain 17.3 big blinds per 100, which is astronomical, just by using the minimum bet in this common spot. And there are lots and lots of situations where that will be the case, and we are going to discuss coming up next when you should be betting very small on the flop, and then later when you should be betting very big. Because if you choose the correct bet sizes in these rather interesting scenarios that do come up very frequently, you're going to add a large chunk to your win rate. Also, there's a lot of exploits that come from using various bet sizes as well, and we'll be covering those in the exploits and adjustments section later. But for now, we're going to be sticking to game theory for quite a while, and I want to make sure that you know where to start and how to play a good fundamentally sound strategy, so that then later you'll know how to adjust away from this to take advantage of whatever your opponents do incorrectly. But yeah, dynamic bet sizes, it's important, and it's going to add a lot of money to your win rates. I hope you learned a ton from this video from the Advanced Tournament course. And if you did, why not check out the whole thing right now at pokercoaching.com. The course is big, it's advanced, and it will take your skills to the next level. Remember that right now, we are having the biggest sale of the year, where you can get 61% off. Head over to pokercoaching.com/Black Friday right now to sign up. And before you leave, make sure you smash the like and subscribe buttons down below. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. And I'll see you next time.